So thank you all for joining us this evening. Nick Carter is a science and nature communicator from Edmonton, an avid bird watcher, fossil enthusiast, and all-around fan of natural history. Nick is here to outline the fascinating evolution of modern birds. Welcome, Nick.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And thank you for everybody attending. I was just sort of scoping through the guest list here. Lots of old friends that I'm happy to see their little names next to their black boxes. So that's great. So this is all about sort of where birds come from and how we know where they come from in an evolutionary sense. And it's going to kind of be a summary of other people's research that I've kind of compiled, a very brief summary. It's a very sort of big topic. And it's a topic that I find not quite so many bird watchers are as into as they could be, which I think is kind of a shame, because I think the story of birds is pretty cool. So first question is, what is a bird? Seems obvious, but we'll talk about it anyway. Now, if I've done my job well by the end of this, you're all going to come away not quite knowing exactly what birds are as well as you might have thought, but that's okay. So here in Alberta, we have about 400 species, about 11,000 are known worldwide. Our birds here range from about the size of a little calliope hummingbird at just a couple of grams to the big trumpeter swans. They're one of the 3 types of vertebrate animals that can fly, and they use that to be successful pretty much all over the world. Now, don't worry too much about memorizing all the terminology and anatomy of these things. What characterizes birds, though, in comparison to living things today, they're in their own sort of traditional Linnaean class Aves. They are warm-blooded with a 4-chambered heart. As we all know, they lay eggs and have feathers. They've got this special kind of flow-through air sac system that allows them to breathe. And yeah, that's sort of the important stuff. But I think some of the coolest stuff about birds is their skeletal system. So no birds have teeth. They all have a toothless beak. The bones of the skeleton are all hollow, and that's going to be important later. Hopefully everybody can see my little cursor down here at this pigeon skeleton. This big sort of boat-shaped bone leading to the ribs is the sternum, and then humans have a sternum, but it's pretty small and flat. The sternum of a bird is this big keel-shaped thing for the attachment of flight muscles, and the rest of the skeleton tends to be sort of the trend is their bones tend to fuse or get reduced or even lost. So the clavicles, the collarbones of birds are fused up into what we call a furcula, which just means fork. And most people better know that as the wishbone. And the bones of the hands and the feet get kind of fused up into these singular units. The hips are really sort of big and broad. And the bones of the tail of a bird are these tiny little things with this little nub at the end called a pygostyle. So when you see a bird with a long tail, most of that length is just feathers. So in relation to other modern day vertebrates, we kind of tend to think of birds in the same breadth as mammals because they're active, they're warm-blooded, they're they have a sense of intelligence about them that we can kind of relate to, but their anatomy and their physiology really tells us that they're really just a type of reptile, from all of these traits here that I won't sort of get into, but sort of the way they work on the inside tells us they have a lot more in common with modern day reptiles, in particular crocodiles, than just about anything else, but not much else alive today is particularly like birds. Now, where our ideas about where birds came from really starts here. So the year after Charles Darwin publishes his ideas of natural selection, this old guy from Germany finds this feather impression in this rock from the late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago. And this is the first fossilized remains of a bird, at least one this old. And he names this feather, kind of confusingly enough, not the animal that it belonged to, Archaeopteryx. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about Archaeopteryx before. Soon after, all these skeletons started to emerge that we figured probably belonged to that feather. And, many of you have probably seen things like this before. So a lot of people didn't really know what to make of Archaeopteryx. It had all these bird-like features, namely feathers, but it also had in some ways a very bird-like skeleton with sort of hollow elongate bones. It had a wishbone, or the furcula. The pubis bone, which is right here, kind of between the legs of Archaeopteryx, points backwards as it does in modern birds. And the eyes and the brain of Archaeopteryx, like that of modern birds, were pretty big. But it also had some sort of traditionally reptilian features, including a long bony tail. As we saw earlier, birds today don't have that. It had teeth in its jaws, and it had 3 separate fingers on its hand instead of the one sort of fused up unit of birds today. And its pelvis and its sternum were pretty small. So there was some debate over what to make of this thing. Some paleontologists basically described it as just a very weird, peculiar kind of bird. But others noticed some similarities to dinosaurs that they were finding. Now, this is pretty early in the history of paleontology as a science. Now, getting into dinosaurs really briefly, some people started to notice some things in common between dinosaurs and Archaeopteryx. Now, a lot of people may not actually be quite aware as to what we mean when we say dinosaur. Dinosaur has kind of now started to mean just anything that's sort of big and ferocious, scary looking, and extinct. But dinosaurs are part of this branch of the reptile family tree that we call the archosaurs. So this is also the group that crocodiles are a part of. They're slightly more distantly related to lizards, and even more so to turtles and all these extinct things. I know this diagram is kind of confusing. Don't worry too much about it, though. So dinosaurs all share the single common ancestor that shows up about 233 or so million years ago in the Triassic. And one thing they all sort of tend to have in common is down here, they stand up straight, essentially, with the heads of their femur bones, their thigh bones, at a right angle to the main body of the thigh bone. Just about all other reptiles today have this sprawling posture. And then in that archosaur group, you've got 2 major divisions, one that kind of leads to crocodiles but includes all these other extinct things, and then one leads to the first flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, and the dinosaurs themselves. Now, like I said earlier, just because something is big and extinct doesn't necessarily mean it's a dinosaur. Not all dinosaurs were big. They were very diverse, and spoiler alert, they're not necessarily extinct either. So all these other things that you might see in a museum, and these are just some non-dinosaur things that I photographed in museums across the province. Yeah, they're not dinosaurs, other cool things though that are worthy of their own attention. Now the dinosaurs are split into two major groups, and there's going to be a lot of sort of splitting of groups here. I'll try to keep everything as simple as possible. Hopefully it all stays clear. And these major divisions are based on their hip anatomy. So these are the three bones in the hip that you're looking at from the side. One is called the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and it's because that pubic bone that we talked about earlier points forwards, as it does in lizards and more primitive reptiles, to use an outdated term. The other is the ornithischians, the bird-hipped dinosaurs, and they were called that because their pubic bone points backwards. Now, another spoiler, one of these groups has something to do with the origin of birds, but it might not be the group that you're thinking of based off this information alone. So here's what those major divisions look like. On the bird-hipped dinosaur side, you've got things with armor and spikes and plates, your stegosaurs and ankylosaurs and stuff. You've got your duckbills, you've got your horned dinosaurs and your dome head things. And then your saurischians, your lizard-hipped dinosaurs, you've got your big long-necked plant-eating sauropods, and then the two-legged, generally meat-eating things, the theropods, which includes T-Rex and all sorts of other things. Now here in Alberta, it's no secret that we're very rich in dinosaurs. Indigenous peoples here have known about dinosaurs from their fossils for a long time before everybody else started finding them. The first scientifically described dinosaur from Alberta was, fittingly enough, old Albertosaurus here. This is from the Royal Tyrrell Museum, found in the Badlands near Drumheller, and it was discovered by Joseph Tyrrell. That's why they named the museum after him. Lots of paleontology hotspots in Alberta. I could be here all day talking about that. But moving right along. So back to Archaeopteryx. Around that time, we were kind of starting to find, dinosaurs that weren't just these big monstrous looking things, but it turns out there was little dinosaurs as well. And one that was kind of found nearby was this thing called Compsognathus. And paleontologists started to kind of figure, well, if you hold that up next to Archaeopteryx, there's some similarities. And then you hold Archaeopteryx up next to a modern day bird, there's some similarities as well. So some people started to think, hey, maybe we've got this evolutionary grade happening with Archaeopteryx as representing an intermediate step between these non-avian dinosaurs and modern day birds. And it being the 19th century, all sorts of wealthy old white men with wacky facial hair kind of weighed in on it. This guy even found some fossilized birds from North America that had teeth. So what do you make of that? Birds with teeth. That should tell you something. And, around that time, a little bit after, we started finding all these really bird-like dinosaurs from all over the world. Here's Dromaeosaurus and Struthiomimus from right here in Alberta, as well as some really bird-like predators from Mongolia, namely Velociraptor, but some other things as well. So, scientists looked at these things and they were like, well, their skeletons are very bird-like, so maybe these things can inform us as to where birds came from. Until this guy shows up, and he writes this book all about, just as far as we can tell, sort of the first full book on hypothesizing the origin of birds. And he says, there's a lot of similarities between these little snippy dinosaurs like Compsognathus we're finding and Archaeopteryx and modern day birds. But he points out that in dinosaurs, we had never found a wishbone. We never even found unfused collarbones in any of these things. And so he figures, how could birds have evolved fused collarbones when their supposed ancestors never had them to begin with? So he rejects the dinosaur hypothesis and substitutes his own, which is pretty vague. He kind of thinks that maybe birds evolved from what were then called thecodontians, these sort of crocodile lineage type archosaurs back in the Triassic. And that there wasn't anything sort of concrete leading there, but he figured that we would find evidence of it one of these days. And he proposes this intermediate thing that he calls proaves down here on the bottom right, sort of an earlier ancestor of Archaeopteryx type things. And you can see one gliding right down here with its limbs spread out. This will be kind of interesting later. But this never really takes off in a big way, and scientists are kind of shrugging their shoulders for a long time when it comes to the origin of birds, until this titan of paleontology, John Ostrom, finds this thing called Deinonychus. And for those Jurassic Park fans out there, this is kind of what the Jurassic Park raptors are mostly based off. So he finds this in Montana from the early Cretaceous, and he points out all of these bird-like traits in the skeleton that make this a very quick and agile and intelligent animal. And all throughout the 70s, he starts publishing all these papers saying that, if you compare things like Deinonychus to Archaeopteryx and to birds, there really is some strong signals that, the anatomy of these things is very similar and points to those scientists of yesterday who were kind of thinking that, maybe birds had evolved from dinosaurs all along, wasn't as wild as it appeared. So here's a diagram right here kind of showing, the three individual digits of the hand of Deinonychus, and then you still have individual digits in Archaeopteryx, but they're much more elongate. The two outer fingers are kind of joined together. The thumb is kind of shrinking, and then you have its end progression in modern birds. So this is the middle finger right there. The outer one is shrunk and kind of fused up with it, and then this is all that remains of the thumb. And so this is the hand of a bird. And this kicks off all sorts of young scientists at the time rethinking what we thought we knew about birds and dinosaurs, and we start finding all sorts of evidence that dinosaurs were, if not warm-blooded, at least not these sort of cold-blooded, sluggish, lizard-like things that we used to think. We figured out that they take good care of their offspring. We find dinosaur nests with associated parents and all sorts of other bird-like traits in them. This person, Halska Zmolska, and colleagues find all of these really bird-like things out in Mongolia. There's all these expeditions of Polish scientists out there, and they find things like this. This is Gallimimus, many of you may have heard of, one of the ostrich mimic dinosaurs. If you've ever seen the skull of a bird, I mean, long toothless snout, big eyes, relatively large brain, that's pretty birdy. Closer to home in Dinosaur Provincial Park, we find this thing called Stenonychosaurus, which is kind of a relative of the raptors, the dromaeosaurs. It's part of a group called the Troodontids. And it was known for very fragmentary remains for a long time, but one of them was a few actually were found with sort of associated bones, and this included parts of the skull, notably parts of the brain case and the eyes. One of these brain cases was actually found by Nature Alberta's patron, John Acorn, back in the day. I'm sure he could tell you the account much more interestingly than I could, but we start gathering all this data on this thing, and the great theropod expert from Canada, Phil Curry, publishes a paper outlining the bird-like characteristics of the teeth and jaws of troodontids like Stenonychosaurus. So there's some local input on that front. And then from China, all of these little dinosaurs that kind of look like roadkill start to be discovered. And this is on the right here called Sinosauropteryx. It's a close relative of Compsognathus. And if you look kind of along the edge of Sinosauropteryx here, you can see what looks like hair. This is actually what we call proto-feathers, sort of the very earliest types of feathers. So that's a pretty big deal. People were really shocked about this. And since birds are the only animals today that have feathers, and here we've got a feathered dinosaur, getting pretty hard to argue that Ostrom was right all along. And then some of these other things, some of these co-authored by Dr. Curry are found in China. Microraptor that you might have heard of right here even has wings. So you can see these are feather impressions, just like what we found in Archaeopteryx. These aren't like, literally fossilized feathers, but they're in position. And this Microraptor, which is a sort of distant relative of, semi-distant relative of Velociraptor, has wings on its front legs and back legs. This is an Alberta species called Hesperonychus from Dinosaur Provincial Park, I do believe, which is a close relative of Microraptor, probably looked really similar. And this thing might have been able to glide or fly to some degree based on its wing anatomy, but we're still kind of arguing over exactly how. This turkey-like thing is called Archaeopteryx, and you can see some feather impressions on the hands and the tip of the tail there. So the evidence of birds being dinosaurs starts to look pretty convincing at this point, but that's not even near the end of the evidence that's out there. And if we follow along the theropod dinosaur evolutionary tree leading towards where we think birds fit in with this, we can see how they slowly acquired all of the anatomical characters that we discussed earlier in their dinosaur ancestors. So most theropod dinosaurs had hollow bones, or at least part of the skeleton was hollow to some degree. They're chambered sections of their vertebrae, basically these sort of scooped out areas in the backbones and the neck bones, hint that they breathed in a very similar manner to birds. Birds don't sort of fill up their lungs and then exhale the way we do. They've got all these air sacs, kind of like organic balloons throughout their body. Those fill with air. They push the air sort of passively through the lungs, which don't inflate or deflate, and then it goes out. Looks like dinosaurs were doing something pretty similar, and we start finding wishbones, furculas in dinosaurs. So it turns out they had them all along, and we just didn't know about it. Here is a skeleton of a turkey vulture that I put together for the Royal Alberta Museum, and you can see it's got a flexible wrist joint right here. So that's how birds fold up their wings. So if you've ever seen somebody do an impression of a dinosaur and they're doing what we call bunny hands, sort of turning the palms down and inwards, dinosaurs couldn't rotate their wrists like that. They generally held their palms facing inwards as if they were clapping, but that's kind of the same motion as flapping your wings. And thanks to this bone in the wrist here that we call the semilunate carpal, which we see in things like Deinonychus. It had that flexible wrist joint, not to the same degree as a modern bird, but it was even more well developed in Archaeopteryx. Looking at the hips of dinosaurs, some people had thought initially that because the big plant-eating dinosaurs, the bird-hipped ornithischians, had their pubic bones pointing backwards, that maybe they somehow were the ancestral group to modern birds. But if we look at theropod dinosaurs, sort of starting with something that's a bit more basal, like Ceratosaurus here, this is the pubis bone, and it's pointing forwards. But as you get a bit more close to birds, you notice that the pubic bone starts to rotate backwards until you get to these, late Cretaceous things that are more or less indistinguishable from the arrangement you see in birds today. So that was a really gradual thing, and was probably influenced by the gaits, the way that these animals are walking, and the musculature is changing. If you look at the feet and the legs of birds and compare them to these meat-eating dinosaurs, in general they're pretty similar, but you kind of see a shift from the thighs being the driving force in walking to being more at the knee joint and the shins and the ankles doing most of the work. So what you see in birds, if you ever think that that joint in the leg that's bending backwards is like a backwards knee, that's actually the ankle bone. And so here we can see this is an Oviraptorosaur, a group of very bird-like dinosaurs here on the left, and it's got these really elongate foot bones that in things closer to birds start to sort of fuse up. Here's that furcula, that wishbone. It doesn't look exactly like the wishbone that you might pull out of a turkey, for example, on Thanksgiving, but you can see it's kind of got that general shape. And also the hip socket. So in the hip socket of something like a mammal, it's closed in with bone here. So it's kind of like a cup that fits the head of the femur, but it's completely open and see-through in birds, and so is as well in dinosaurs. So there's another hint that there's a connection there. And you can see we were talking about that air sac lung system in birds, and if that was present, which it almost certainly was in theropod dinosaurs, it indicates that they probably had a very similar metabolic rate. So these things, many of them at least, were probably not necessarily cold-blooded. In fact, on that front, here is some new research, relatively new, from this year, published by my friend Corwin Sullivan from the U of A and his student Yan. And they found these little projecting bones off the ribs of dinosaurs. Now, these are present in birds as well. And these little bony projections off of the ribs basically help the thorax area to expand and contract, and powers the flow of air through a bird's body. And the fact that dinosaurs have these as well indicates that theropod dinosaurs were breathing just the same way that birds do. Getting into feathers. Now, feathers are pretty complicated things. A lot of people think that they might be kind of similar to hair or fur. Now, they're made of keratin, just like your hair is, but they're a lot more complicated. They're made from this sort of central shaft called a rachis, and then these little filaments come off the side called barbs, and these things function kind of like almost like Velcro. They have these little tiny hooks that latch onto each other and give the feather, particularly feathers that you get on the outside of a bird's body called contour feathers, or on the tail or the wings, sort of a continuous surface, which is useful for flying. So they grow really different than things like hair. And we've been able to kind of map out how feathers changed. The earliest feathers up on the right here kind of look like number one here, what we saw in things like Sinosauropteryx. These are called monofilaments. So basically just a single sort of strand of keratin. And we can see how throughout the evolution of theropod dinosaurs, that gradually gets more and more complicated to these branching structures. And then you have complex veined feathers, including ones that are asymmetrical, which is important for flying. If you ever look at the wing feather of a bird, they're larger on one end than the other. And the display plumes and things like that you'll get in really showy species. Now, when exactly or where exactly feathers arose in the evolution of dinosaurs is kind of still up for debate. We know that they were probably at least ancestral to one group of the meat eaters that we call the coelurosaurs, which includes everything from the tyrannosaurs and compsognathids all through all the really birdy things, and excludes some of the other sort of classic big theropods, the big meat eaters that you might be familiar with, like Spinosaurus or Giganotosaurus. But we also have some little plant eaters as well that had little feathery tufts or bristles on them. So we're trying to make sense of that. And also the pterosaurs as well, the flying reptiles, had what we used to call pycnofibers on the body, which we weren't quite sure whether they were the same thing as feathers. Now it looks like they might be, in fact. So it could be that the common ancestor of dinosaurs and pterosaurs had some kind of fuzz, and then in a bunch of other later dinosaurs, like your horned dinosaurs and your long necks and your duckbills, they went back to having scales, and then feathers developed in other groups from there. It's a tricky thing. Now, you might be asking, what is the use for flying of a little bristle or, downy sort of thing like this? And the answer is it's no use at all. So that tells us that feathers did not show up in dinosaurs initially for the purpose of flight. Now, what were they using them for? Probably a variety of things it could have been. This includes keeping warm, thermal regulation. So even like simple down is really good for keeping warm, especially if you're a warm-blooded animal. It's expensive to produce heat, so you want to trap that heat close to your body to insulate yourself. So feathers are really great for that. Also, tactile sensitivity, so basically acting like whiskers. Some modern birds have little feathers that are essentially bristles near the nose that kind of work the same way as the whiskers of a dog or a cat. So maybe they were playing a role like that in small little proto-feathered dinosaurs. They could have also been used for display. So think about how many birds today use their feathers to show off to each other, either to attract a mate or to scare off a threat, things like that. And these are powerful drivers for evolution. And so it might have been a combination of these things that led to the development of feathers. And then in at least one group that we call the paravians, basically birds and their closest non-bird dinosaur relatives, they sort of co-opted feathers for locomotion, including flight. Here's some really cool evidence in Velociraptor itself. This is the ulna bone, the lower arm bone of a velociraptor. And these authors found these little nubs along the underside of the bone, and these are quill knobs. And in modern birds, these are attachment of large wing feathers. They basically help to anchor it to the bone. And so their presence in Velociraptor tells us that not only did this dinosaur have proto feathers, but it had proper feathers, much like that of a modern bird, and it probably had wings. Now, could Velociraptor fly? Almost certainly not. But these wings may have assisted it in something else, maybe helping it to capture prey, or propel itself really quickly on the ground, or maybe to stall itself if it climbed up a rock or a stunted tree or something and fell off. Who knows? But they were probably there. Another thing closer to home is this feathered ornithomimosaur. This is related to Gallimimus that you might be familiar with from Jurassic Park, one of the ostrich mimic dinosaurs. Now, it's important to note that ostriches didn't evolve directly from these things, but they're sort of superficially similar. This particular example was published just a few years ago. It was found by my friend Derek Larson in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And there's a couple examples of these things from Alberta, actually, that show limited degrees of feather preservation. Now, they weren't quite as advanced of feathers as you'll see in the raptors and the sort, but they had like downy coverings on them, probably to help keep warm. And then sort of a wing-like arrangement on the front limbs, maybe to help them show off or something. When it comes to parental care, we all know that birds are really good parents. They will do brooding, which is the scientific term for sitting on a nest, protecting the eggs, keeping them warm and safe. And we've got fossilized examples of dinosaurs doing that very same thing. So this is an oviraptorosaur called Sitapati from Mongolia. And we found at least 2 examples of this thing sitting on its nest. So there's the neck, and up at the upper left here of this one on the left, and the limbs, and then underneath the arms of both of these are all of its eggs. So these are parent dinosaurs that probably died in some kind of sandstorm or a dune collapse or something, and were buried trying to protect their eggs from the elements. So very brave parents. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for them. And the placement of their arms also indicates they probably had sort of a pseudo wings, as you might call them, that they were maybe trying to shield their eggs with. So that's pretty cool. We can also see some neat evidence in Tyrannosaurus itself. So Tyrannosaurus was found with medullary bone, which is basically a calcium storage in the long bones of the dinosaur, which is something that's normally only known from modern day birds, females that are about to lay eggs. They basically store calcium in the bones in order to make eggshells, and we've got that in Tyrannosaurus itself. So there's some affinity there. Looking at vestigial traits in birds, and these are sort of leftover body parts from earlier relatives in the evolutionary tree. And one cool thing you can see in some birds today. Now, this is the tip of a wing of a trumpeter swan that I dissected. And where that arrow is pointing right there, you can see right next to this big wing feather, that is a claw on the wing of the swan. And it's not the only kind of bird that has that. Now, it's a really tiny, tiny claw, but it's there. And so, there's your evidence that they came from things that had claws on their wings. Many dinosaurs were very social. So we have all sorts of bone beds from around the world, including Alberta, some of which are from meat eaters or plant eaters. This is from a Pachyrhinosaurus bone bed I spent a lot of time at once upon a time. And, they formed herds and flocks similar to birds today. We can find evidence of soft tissue preservation. So things like, the remains of skin in this chicken wing thing here from this potentially non-avian dinosaur. It had what we call a patagium, basically a flap of skin that helped with aerodynamicism in the wing. So now the question is, we've got in the fossil record all of these little snippy, meat-eating, sometimes beaked dinosaur bird type things, and where we have to ask ourselves, where do we draw the line on where whether things are a bird versus a dinosaur that isn't a bird? And it's kind of a controversial issue. Starting at the paraves, we talked about these earlier. So these include birds as well as the dromaeosaurs and the troodontids that are colloquially called the raptors, quote unquote. So these are all these little bird-like things from the late Jurassic through to the early Cretaceous, and a lot of these species don't fall neatly into one particular group. Up on the upper right here is Enantiornithes, and there's been a lot of debate as to what group it falls in. Some people initially thought it was a troodontid like Stenonychosaurus, but now it seems to be maybe closer related to birds, probably a decently close relative of Archaeopteryx. Also unclear which of these things could fly versus which would, maybe we're just gliding. Versus completely flightless. The origin of flight is very complicated and contentious, and may not have happened only once. So what we in paleontology sort of call the broader group of birds is the aviale. So these are avian dinosaurs, all species more closely related to modern birds than they are to the raptors, dromaeosaurs, and troodontids. And that doesn't mean modern raptors like hawks and eagles, by the way. So Archaeopteryx, generally found to be one of the earliest avialans. They used to call Archaeopteryx the first bird. It might not necessarily deserve that title anymore. It's kind of one of many first birds. Kind of more advanced than that, one of the first things that birds lost was that long bony tail, and this group that lost that, we call that the Pygostylia. So these are birds that evolved that stubby little nubbin tail, and one of the earliest examples of that is the Confuciusornithids, which is a very hard word to spell, but these are birds from China that the males are really cool. They had these long ribbon-like display feathers. They were capable of flying at least to some degree, but they still had teeth and claws. Slightly more advanced or more like modern birds than that are this group called the Enantiornithes, which isn't the last complicated word I get to pronounce for all of you, but these are called the opposite birds. And these are the most common and diverse of the avialans of the Cretaceous period. So they kind of show up probably in the early to mid Cretaceous, and somebody might correct me on that, but they quickly became very diverse, and a lot of them sort of evolved traits and appearances that were very analogous to that of birds today, like Longipteryx here that kind of resembled a kingfisher, but it wasn't a kingfisher. So these things could definitely fly, but they still had teeth in their jaws, and they still had claws on their wing fingers, but they did have an enlarged sternum. So definitely better at powered flight. And the sister group to these things is called the true birds, the Euornithes. And this basically, the major group of this is the Ornithurae. That just means bird tails. So their tails are more like modern birds than everything else that's shown up so far. And this is the common ancestor of all modern birds, as well as you might remember near the beginning of this talk, we talked about that guy with the wacky facial hair who found these toothed birds. These are the Hesperornithes and the Ichthyornithes. Up on the right here is Hesperornis, which was a really big bird. This thing was about 4 feet tall or so, and it lost its wings, but it had these long, powerful legs that were built for swimming, and it lived in the inland seaway at the time of the dinosaurs. So, something this advanced is around at the same time as things like Velociraptor and such, which are less bird-like. Ichthyornis right here was a flying bird. And from kind of the neck down, or sort of the palate down, these things are very similar to, pretty much indistinguishable really, from most modern birds, but they obviously still had teeth. We do find some bones of things like this from Alberta, but they're pretty rare and pretty fragmentary. We've also got fossilized in amber from near Grand Prairie, some feathers that might belong to one of these things. Now, birds as we know them today belong to class Aves, which is kind of the same thing as this group that we call the Neornithes, the new birds. And this is the common ancestor of all modern birds and all of its descendants, which probably split off in the late Cretaceous period and continues today. Now, they were kind of hanging out in the background and not really, doing anything terribly interesting while the rest of the dinosaurs were around, until you've got the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, and that opens up a lot of sort of evolutionary space for these things to diversify, which they did very, very quickly. So around the time of the dinosaur extinction, we see the ancestors of modern bird groups appearing pretty quickly. And this is an early one called Enantiornithes. So most of the early modern birds from around the late time of the dinosaurs were these little sort of grouse-like type things that spent most of their time on the ground. Here's some relatively famous fossil birds from just after the time of the dinosaurs. You had sort of duck-like things like Presbyornis, Gastornis, which, while it looks scary, was probably a fruit eater, and things that almost kind of resemble modern-day songbirds, even though it's about 50 million years old. So kind of the big question that we're asking ourselves today is, how did the ancestors of modern birds survive and everything else died off? And we've got a few ideas as to how they were able to push through. One thing is the fact that the toothless beak probably helped them out a lot. This is research done by my friend Derek and his colleagues. And the idea is that having a toothless beak meant that these earlier birds, kind of like this nuthatch and this grouse would be doing, are mostly feeding on foods that are high in energy and last a long time, mainly like seeds, that kind of stuff. They also spent most of their time on the ground instead of perching in trees, as a lot of birds do today. The earlier things like the Enantiornithes were mostly tree-dwelling birds. The Hesperornithes, Ichthyornithes were spending a lot of time in the water. When the meteor hit that killed off all the dinosaurs, that pretty much boiled the seas and wiped out most of the forests in the world, and so those became pretty inhospitable places. But if you were kind of small and could take cover, under logs or even in little burrows, and weren't too picky about what you ate, and could just sort of peck away at seeds in the dust, you stood a pretty good chance. And having relatively large brains as well may have helped modern birds figure out what the best resources for survival were, to get them through. Now, kind of the question I'll leave you with is, birds are probably older than a lot of people may have assumed that they were, and they've been through a lot, but will they survive us? That's the question. A lot of birds, things like pigeons and magpies and ravens are doing pretty good. in and around human civilization. But within the last few hundred years, we've lost quite a number of birds. And a lot of species populations are on the decline. At least 8 native bird species in Alberta are considered at risk. And so, they've been around for a while, and we got to figure out how to keep them around because, they're literally living dinosaurs. We don't want to lose them. So that has been that. Hopefully I didn't bog anybody down too much with all the complicated names, and I'm honestly impressed with myself that I did this in under an hour. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stick around for as long as it takes to answer those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. I'm just going to stop the recording, but if everyone wants to put the clapping hands in their little box, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I certainly